A Knight's Burden. Arlington, 1921. Claudia Reed discovered a discarded military badge in a dark alley, its surface engraved with an honor of Lieutenant Oscar Grant, evoking a tale of sacrifice. Chapter 1. The Alley's Secret. The gaslight flickered, casting long, skeletal shadows down the narrow alleyway. Rain, a persistent drizzle that had plagued Arlington all day, slicked the cobblestones, turning them into treacherous mirrors reflecting the weak, amber glow. Claudia Reed pulled her worn woolen coat tighter, the damp chill seeping into her bones despite the fabric's thickness. She hurried, her sensible shoes clicking a sharp rhythm against the stones, eager to reach the warmth of her small boarding house room. It was already past dusk, and the streets, even this close to the National Cemetery, held a certain unease after dark. She almost missed it. A glint, a dull metallic shimmer in the deeper shadows where the overflowing bins huddled against the brick wall. Curiosity, a trait that had often led her into trouble and, occasionally, out of it, tugged at her. Claudia hesitated, then, with a quick glance up and down the deserted alley, she crouched down. It was a military badge, lying face down in the grime. Claudia picked it up, her fingers brushing away the accumulated dirt and wet leaves. The metal was cold, surprisingly heavy in her palm. Turning it over, she held it closer to the flickering gaslight. The inscription, though worn, was still legible. In honor of Lieutenant Oscar Grant. The name meant nothing to her. But the weight of the badge, the formal inscription, spoke of service, of sacrifice. Arlington, after all, was a town steeped in both. The sprawling cemetery, visible even from this dingy alley as a vast, dark expanse punctuated by the faint, ghostly gleam of white headstones, was a constant reminder. 3 years after the Great War's end, the town still breathed loss, still wore the somber hues of mourning. Claudia herself carried her own quiet grief. Her fiancé, Thomas, had sailed for France with the American Expeditionary Forces in 1917, full of youthful patriotism and the promise of a swift return. He hadn't. A telegram, stark and brutal in its brevity, had arrived a year later, informing her of his death at Belleauwood. The telegram was tucked inside a hidden pocket of her jewelry box, and she would take it out and read it, at night, when everyone was asleep. She traced the engraved letters of the badge with her thumb. Lieutenant Oscar Grant. Another soldier, another story. But why was his badge here, discarded in an alley, like common rubbish? It felt wrong. A desecration, almost. Soldiers were revered, their sacrifices lauded, their memories enshrined in monuments and parades. This badge, a tangible symbol of that sacrifice, deserved better. Claudia knew she should probably just leave it. It wasn't her business. She was a woman alone, trying to rebuild a life shattered by war, working as a typist at the War Department, a job that offered a meager living and a constant, painful proximity to the machinery of conflict. She had enough burdens without adding a lost badge to the list. But the thought of leaving it there, in the mud and the darkness, gnawed at her. It felt like abandoning a piece of someone's history, a fragment of a life cut short. And perhaps, subconsciously, it was a way to connect, however tangentially, with Thomas. To honor his memory, by honoring another's. The rain intensified, the drops splattering against the brick walls, washing away the grime but not the sense of unease that had settled over Claudia. She made a decision. Slipping the badge into her coat pocket, she straightened up, her gaze lingering for a moment on the spot where it had lain. "I'll find out who you are, Lieutenant Grant," she whispered to the empty alley, the words swallowed by the rain and the growing darkness. "I promise you that." She resumed her walk, the badge a heavy, insistent presence against her hip. The boarding house, a faded Victorian with peeling paint and a perpetually damp smell, loomed ahead. Mrs. Peterson, her landlady, a woman whose sharp tongue was softened only by the occasional, unexpected act of kindness, would be waiting, likely with a disapproving frown and a lecture about the dangers of walking alone at night. But tonight, Claudia didn't care. She had a mystery to solve, a promise to keep. And somehow, in the heart of a grieving town, A discarded badge had sparked a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years. Purpose. A reason to look beyond her own sorrow, to reach out and touch the life of another, even if that life was only a ghost, a name etched on a piece of metal. The weight in her pocket was no longer just a badge, it was a burden, a responsibility, and a strange, unexpected source of hope. The alley seemed to whisper behind her, a secret urging her forward, into the unknown. Chapter 2. Echoes of Arlington. The boarding house smelled of boiled cabbage and old newspapers, a familiar, if not entirely pleasant, aroma that usually signaled Mrs. Peterson's impending supper. Tonight, however, Claudia barely noticed. She slipped past the landlady's parlor, where the faint sounds of a crackling radio program a comedy, judging by the canned laughter spilled out into the hallway, and hurried up the creaking stairs to her room. It was small, sparsely furnished with a narrow bed, a chipped dresser, and a single, threadbare armchair. But it was hers, a sanctuary from the world and its sorrows. Claudia closed the door behind her, leaning against it for a moment, her breath catching in her chest. The badge, still nestled in her coat pocket, felt strangely warm now, as if imbued with a life of its own. She took it out, placing it on the small, rickety table that served as her desk. The single electric bulb hanging from the ceiling cast a harsh, unforgiving light, highlighting the badge's worn edges and the intricate details of its design. It was a standard-issue military badge, she realized, recognizing the familiar eagle and shield motif. But the inscription that was personal, that was a link to a specific individual, a soldier with a name and, presumably, a story. Claudia sat down, her fingers tracing the inscription again. Lieutenant Oscar Grant. The name echoed in her mind, a whisper from the past. She opened the top drawer of her dresser, rummaging through the carefully organized contents. A few precious letters from Thomas, tied together with a faded ribbon, a small, silver-framed photograph of them together, taken just before he shipped out a handkerchief embroidered with his initials. And then there was the telegram, the one she had read countless times, each reading chipping away at the edges of her heart, but never losing its power to wound. She unfolded it carefully, the paper thin and brittle with age. The words, stark and black against the yellowed paper, still held the power to make her breath catch. Regret to inform you Lieutenant Thomas A. Parker killed in action below with June 6, 1918. Deepest sympathies. The official language, the cold formality, offered no comfort, no solace. It was a death sentence, delivered with bureaucratic detachment. Claudia refolded the telegram, her fingers trembling slightly. She placed it back in the drawer, a silent acknowledgement of the grief that still resided within her, a constant companion. She turned her attention back to the badge. Lieutenant Grant. Another lieutenant, another casualty of war, perhaps. But why the discarded badge? It didn't make sense. Soldiers, even deceased soldiers, were treated with reverence. Their belongings were carefully returned to their families, cherished as sacred relics. Claudia decided to start her search at the War Department. Her job as a typist, while monotonous, gave her access to a wealth of information, to personnel files, casualty lists, and countless other documents that flowed through the department like a relentless river. She might be able to find some record of Lieutenant Grant, some clue to his identity and his fate. The next morning, the rain had stopped, leaving behind a washed-clean sky and a crisp, autumnal air. Arlington, even in its grief, held a certain beauty. The grand, neoclassical buildings, the manicured lawns, the imposing presence of the cemetery, all spoke of a nation grappling with its past and its future. The War Department building was a hive of activity, a cacophony of typewriters clacking, phones ringing, and hushed conversations. Claudia navigated the familiar corridors, nodding to colleagues, her mind already focused on her task. She slipped into the records room, a vast, cavernous space filled with towering shelves and endless rows of filing cabinets. The air was thick with the smell of dust and old paper. Mrs. Henderson, the head archivist, a stern, bespectacled woman with a surprisingly encyclopedic knowledge of the department's records, looked up from her desk as Claudia approached. "Miss Reed," she said, her voice sharp but not unkind. "What can I do for you?" Claudia explained her mission, showing Mrs. Henderson the badge. The archivist examined it closely, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Lieutenant Oscar Grant," she murmured, repeating the name. "It sounds vaguely familiar, but there were so many." She led Claudia to a section of the room dedicated to casualty records. The sheer volume of files was overwhelming, a stark reminder of the war's devastating toll. Mrs. Henderson began to search, her fingers flying over the index cards, her eyes scanning the handwritten entries. Hours passed. Claudia assisted, her own search becoming increasingly frantic. She found Grants, dozens of them, but none with the first name Oscar. The hope that had flickered so brightly the previous night began to dim, replaced by a growing sense of futility. Just as she was about to give up, Mrs. Henderson let out a small gasp. "Here it is," she said, pulling out a thin, worn file. "Grant, Oscar. Lieutenant, 12th Infantry Regiment. Killed in action October 28, 1918 near the Meuse-Argonne." Claudia's heart pounded. She had found him, but the information, like the telegrams she had received about Thomas, was sparse and impersonal. It didn't explain the discarded badge. "Is there anything else?" Claudia asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Anything about his family? His personal effects?" Mrs. Henderson shook her head. "Not in this file. There might be something in the personnel records, but those are kept in a separate section, and access is restricted." Restricted. Another obstacle. Claudia felt a surge of frustration. She had come so close, only to hit another wall. But she wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. The badge, tucked safely in her pocket, felt like a weight, a reminder of the promise she had made. As she left the records room, a thought struck her. The Meuse-Argonne. That was one of the last major battles of the war, a brutal, bloody conflict that had claimed thousands of lives. There were bound to be veterans still in Arlington, men who had fought alongside Lieutenant Grant, who might remember him, who might know something about his fate. She would find them. She would ask questions. She would piece together the story of Lieutenant Oscar Grant, one fragmented memory at a time. The echoes of Arlington, the whispers of the past, were calling to her, and she was determined to listen. Chapter 3. The Widow's Photograph. Finding veterans of the Meuse-Argonne was easier said than done. While Arlington was full of men who had served, identifying those who had specifically fought in that particular battle and who might remember a specific officer proved a daunting challenge. Claudia spent her lunch breaks and evenings scouring the local veterans' halls, the American Legion posts, and even the park benches near the cemetery, where older men often gathered to share stories and camaraderie. She showed them the badge, carefully recounting her discovery, asking if the name Lieutenant Oscar Grant rang any bells. Most shook their heads, their eyes clouded with the memories of their own losses, their own traumas. Some offered vague recollections of other Grants, other battles, but nothing concrete, nothing that connected to the badge in her pocket. The frustration began to mount. Claudia felt like she was chasing a ghost, a phantom figure who existed only in the inscription on a piece of metal. She started to doubt herself, to wonder if her quest was futile, a distraction from her own unresolved grief. One evening, after a particularly fruitless search, she found herself back at the boarding house, sitting alone in her room, the badge lying on the table, its metallic gleam mocking her efforts. She picked it up, turning it over and over in her hands. The weight of it, the coldness of the metal, felt oppressive now, a symbol of her failure. A knock on the door startled her. It was Mrs. Peterson, her landlady, her usually stern face softened by an unusual expression of concern. "Miss Reed," she said, her voice surprisingly gentle. "There's a gentleman here to see you." A gentleman? Claudia couldn't imagine who it could be. She hadn't received a male visitor since Thomas. Her heart fluttered with a mixture of apprehension and curiosity. She followed Mrs. Peterson downstairs, her hand instinctively reaching for the badge in her pocket. In the parlor, a man stood by the window, his back to her. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a military bearing that was unmistakable, even in civilian clothes. When he turned, Claudia's breath caught in her throat. He was older, perhaps in his late 40s, with silver threading through his dark hair and lines etched around his eyes and mouth, the marks of time and hardship. But his eyes, they were a striking shade of blue, intense and piercing, and they held a depth of sadness that resonated with her own. "Miss Reed?" he said, his voice a low, resonant rumble. "My name is Arthur Blackwood. I believe you've been asking about Lieutenant Oscar Grant." Claudia could only nod, her mind reeling. How had he found her? Who was he? He gestured towards a worn armchair. "May I sit down?" Claudia nodded again, finding her voice at last. "Please." He sat, his movements deliberate, almost cautious. He held himself with a certain stiffness, as if nursing an old injury. "Mrs. Peterson mentioned you'd been showing a badge around," he said, his gaze fixed on her. "A badge belonging to Lieutenant Grant." "Yes," Claudia said, her voice trembling slightly. "I found it in an alley. I've been trying to find out what happened to him, why it was discarded." Arthur Blackwood sighed, a deep, weary sound. "Oscar Grant was my best friend," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We served together in France. I was with him when he died." Claudia's heart ached for him, for the pain that was so evident in his eyes, in his voice. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the badge, placing it on the small table between them. He stared at it for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, he reached out and picked it up, his fingers tracing the inscription, just as Claudia had done countless times. "I gave him this badge," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It was a gift. A token of our friendship. He always wore it, even in battle. He said it brought him luck." He looked up at Claudia, his eyes filled with a mixture of grief and confusion. "I don't understand how it ended up in an alley. I thought his belongings were sent back to his wife." His wife. Claudia hadn't considered that possibility. The file at the War Department had mentioned nothing about a spouse. "He was married?" she asked, her voice soft. Arthur nodded. "Her name is Eleanor. Eleanor Grant. They were married just before he shipped out."
A vir vim romance, avarti-me wed.
He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, leather-bound photograph album. He opened it carefully, revealing a collection of faded, sepia-toned photographs. He pointed to one in particular. It was a picture of a young couple standing in front of a church, their faces radiant with happiness. The man was tall, handsome, with a mischievous glint in his eyes. He was wearing a military uniform, and on his chest, Claudia could just make out the faint outline of the badge. The woman was beautiful, with dark, curly hair and a smile that could light up a room. She was clutching a bouquet of flowers, her hand intertwined with the man's. "That's Oscar," Arthur said, his voice choked with emotion. "And that's Eleanor." Claudia stared at the photograph, her heart aching for the young couple, for the love that had been cut short by war. She looked at Eleanor's smiling face, and a sudden, chilling thought struck her. A widow. A young widow, left to grieve alone. And a discarded badge, a symbol of a love that had been lost, perhaps too painful to keep. "Do you know where Eleanor is now?" Claudia asked, her voice urgent. "Do you know where I can find her?" Arthur nodded slowly. "She lives here in Arlington, not far from the cemetery." He gave her the address, writing on a scrap piece of paper. He was hesitant. "She does not speak of Oscar. It has been too much." Claudia understood. The photograph, the address, the story, it all pointed to Eleanor. She had to find her, to return the badge, to offer whatever comfort she could. The echoes of Arlington were growing louder, guiding her towards a confrontation with a past that was both heartbreaking and, perhaps, surprisingly hopeful. The picture showed a love, now seemingly lost. But was it? Chapter 4. Whispers in the War Office. The address Arthur Blackwood had given her was a modest, two-story house on a quiet, tree-lined street, not far from the National Cemetery. It was a typical Arlington home, with a small front porch, neatly trimmed hedges, and a general air of understated respectability. But as Claudia approached, she couldn't shake a feeling of unease, a sense of something hidden beneath the surface. She hesitated on the sidewalk, her hand clutching the badge in her pocket. The image of Eleanor Grant, smiling radiantly in the photograph, was still fresh in her mind. A young widow, consumed by grief, perhaps unable to face the reminders of her lost love. Was she intruding? Was she reopening wounds that were better left to heal? But the promise she had made, the whisper of purpose that had driven her this far, wouldn't let her turn back. She took a deep breath and walked up the short path to the front door. She rang the bell, the sound echoing through the quiet house. A few moments passed, and Claudia was about to ring again when the door opened slowly, revealing a woman standing in the shadows. It was Eleanor Grant, but not the vibrant, smiling woman from the photograph. The years and the grief had taken their toll. Her dark hair was streaked with gray, her eyes were hollow and shadowed, and her face was etched with lines of sadness and weariness. She looked older than her years, her youthful beauty faded, replaced by a fragile, almost ethereal quality. "Mrs. Grant?" Claudia asked, her voice soft, hesitant. Eleanor nodded, her gaze wary, questioning. "Yes." Claudia took a deep breath. "My name is Claudia Reed. I found something that I believe belongs to you." She reached into her pocket and pulled out the badge, holding it out to Eleanor. The widow's eyes widened as she saw it, her face paling, her hand flying to her mouth as if to stifle a cry. Where did you find this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Claudia explained about the alley, about her search for Lieutenant Grant, about her conversation with Arthur Blackwood. Eleanor listened in silence, her eyes fixed on the badge, her body swaying slightly, as if she might faint. When Claudia finished, Eleanor reached out and took the badge, her fingers closing around it tightly, as if afraid to let it go. She stared at it for a long moment, her lips moving silently, as if she were speaking to it, to her lost husband. "I thought it was lost," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "I thought I'd never see it again." She looked up at Claudia, her eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for bringing it back to me." Claudia felt a surge of relief, of gratitude. She had done the right thing. She had returned a piece of Eleanor's past, a tangible link to her lost love. But as she looked at Eleanor, at her fragile, grief-stricken face, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. The discarded badge, the widow's pain, Arthur Blackwood's hesitant words, it all pointed to something deeper, something hidden. "Mrs. Grant," Claudia said gently, "is there anything you can tell me about how the badge came to be in the alley? About your husband's death?" Eleanor hesitated, her gaze shifting away, as if she were afraid to meet Claudia's eyes. She took a deep breath, her hands clutching the badge tightly. "It's a long story," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "And a painful one." She invited Claudia inside. The house was sparsely furnished, almost austere, with a sense of emptiness that mirrored Eleanor's own grief. The air was heavy with the scent of dust and old memories. They sat in the small parlor, the silence broken only by the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway. Eleanor placed the badge on the table between them, her eyes fixed on it, as if it held the key to her past. "Oscar, he was a good man," she said, her voice trembling. "A brave man. He loved his country, he loved his duty, and he loved me." She paused, her voice catching in her throat. "But the war, it changed him. It changed everything." She recounted the story of their whirlwind romance, their brief, passionate marriage, Oscar's departure for France, the long, agonizing months of waiting, the letters that grew increasingly infrequent, increasingly distant. "He wrote about the horrors of the trenches," she said, her voice shaking. "The mud, the blood, the constant fear. He said he was losing himself, losing his soul." And then she revealed a secret, a hidden truth that had haunted her for years. A few weeks before his death, Oscar had sent her a letter, a desperate, frantic plea for help. He had written about a conspiracy, a betrayal, something he had uncovered that had put his life in danger. He said he couldn't trust anyone, Eleanor whispered, her eyes wide with fear. He said he was being watched, that he was afraid for his life. And he begged me to destroy the letter, to tell no one. Claudia's heart pounded. A conspiracy? A betrayal? This was far more than a simple case of a lost badge. This was something darker, something more sinister. Did he say what it was about? Claudia asked, her voice urgent. Did he give you any details? Eleanor shook her head.
No.
He just said it was dangerous, that it involved high-ranking officers, that it could destroy everything. She looked at Claudia, her eyes pleading. I didn't know what to do. I was terrified. I burned the letter, just as he asked. But I couldn't forget it. I couldn't shake the feeling that his death, that it wasn't an accident. That it was murder. Murder. The word hung in the air, heavy and ominous. Claudia felt a chill run down her spine. She had stumbled upon something far more complex, far more dangerous, than she had ever imagined. The whispers in the War Office, the secrets hidden in the past, were beginning to take shape, and they painted a picture of betrayal, of conspiracy, and of a love that had been tragically cut short. But the question remains, who ordered the murder, and can she discover the truth before it is too late? Chapter 5. Of Faded Letters, Inc. The revelation that Lieutenant Oscar Grant's death might have been murder sent a shockwave through Claudia. The simple quest to return a lost badge had morphed into a dangerous investigation, a journey into the heart of a wartime conspiracy. She felt a surge of both fear and determination. She couldn't abandon Eleanor, not now, not when the truth was so close, yet so elusive. We need to find out what Oscar knew, Claudia said, her voice firm, resolute. We need to uncover the truth, no matter how dangerous it is. Eleanor nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and a flicker of newfound hope. But where do we start? She asked, her voice trembling. The letter is gone. I have nothing. Claudia thought for a moment.
Arthur Blackwood, she said.
He was Oscar's best friend. He might know something. He might have received a similar letter, or he might have noticed something suspicious during their time in France. Eleanor hesitated. Arthur, he's been through so much. He carries his own scars from the war. I don't want to drag him back into that darkness. Claudia understood her concern. But they had no other leads, no other way to access the truth. We'll be careful, she said. We'll approach him gently. We won't reveal everything, just enough to see if he can shed any light on the situation. They agreed to meet Arthur the following day at the National Cemetery, a place that held both sorrow and significance for all of them. Claudia returned to the boarding house, her mind racing with possibilities, with fears, with the weight of the responsibility she had taken on. She spent the evening poring over the few documents she had. The War Department file on Lieutenant Grant, the photograph of Oscar and Eleanor, and the inscription on the badge. She searched for clues, for hidden meanings, for anything that might connect to Oscar's cryptic warning about a conspiracy. The War Department file, as she had discovered before, was sparse and unrevealing. It listed his basic information, his regiment, his date of death, and the location of his demise. The Meuse are gone. But there was nothing about his personal life, nothing about his wife, nothing about any potential enemies. The photograph, however, offered a glimmer of hope. Claudia studied Oscar's face, his confident smile, his mischievous eyes. He looked like a man who enjoyed life, a man who valued loyalty and friendship. But there was also a hint of something else, a shadow in his eyes, a subtle tension in his jawline. Was it the stress of war? Or was it something more? She turned her attention to the badge. The inscription, in honor of Lieutenant Oscar Grant, was simple, straightforward. But the design, there was something familiar about it. She had seen that particular style of eagle and shield motif before. Somewhere suddenly, it hit her. The War Department. She had seen a similar design on some of the official documents, on the letterheads, on the seals. It was a subtle detail, easily overlooked, but it was there. Could the conspiracy Oscar had uncovered be connected to the War Department itself? Could high-ranking officers be involved in his death? The thought was chilling, but it made a terrifying kind of sense. The War Department was a powerful institution, a place where secrets were kept, where careers were made and broken, where loyalties could be tested and betrayals could be carried out with impunity. Claudia felt a surge of adrenaline. She was on to something. She had a lead, a connection, however tenuous, between Oscar's death and the very institution where she worked. The next morning, she met Eleanor at the National Cemetery. The vast expanse of white headstones, stretching as far as the eye could see, was a sobering reminder of the war's devastating toll. The air was crisp and cool, the sky a clear, brilliant blue. They found Arthur Blackwood standing near Oscar Grant's grave, his head bowed, his hands clasped behind his back. He looked older, more fragile than he had the previous day, the weight of his grief palpable. Claudia and Eleanor approached him slowly, their footsteps crunching on the gravel path. He turned, his eyes red-rimmed, his face etched with sorrow. "Arthur," Eleanor said softly, her voice trembling. "Thank you for coming." He nodded, his gaze shifting between them, his expression questioning. Claudia took a deep breath.
"Arthur," she said,
"we need to talk to you about Oscar. About his death." She explained their suspicions, Eleanor's revelation about the letter, their belief that Oscar might have been murdered. Arthur listened in silence, his face growing increasingly pale, his hands clenching and unclenching. When they finished, he looked at them, his eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and horror. "Murdered?" he whispered.
"But why?"
"Who would want to kill Oscar?" Claudia hesitated. She didn't want to reveal too much, not yet.
"We don't know," she said.
"But we believe it might be connected to something he uncovered during the war. Something he wrote about in a letter to Eleanor." Arthur's brow furrowed. "A letter? I don't know anything about a letter." He paused, his gaze shifting to Eleanor. Did he write to you about something like that?" Eleanor nodded, her eyes filled with tears.
"Yes," she said.
He said he had discovered a conspiracy, a betrayal. He said he couldn't trust anyone. Arthur's eyes widened. "A conspiracy?" he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "But what kind of conspiracy?" He thought for a moment, his mind racing back to their time in France, to the chaos and confusion of the war. Suddenly, his eyes widened, his face paling. "The supplies," he whispered, his voice trembling. "The missing supplies." Claudia and Eleanor exchanged a puzzled look. "What supplies?" Claudia asked. Arthur took a deep breath, his hands shaking.
"There were rumors," he said.
"Whispers in the trenches. About supplies disappearing, about ammunition and food being diverted, about soldiers going hungry, going without. We thought it was just incompetence, mismanagement. But Oscar, he started to investigate. He started to ask questions." He looked at Claudia, his eyes filled with a dawning horror. "He found something," he said. "He found a connection between the missing supplies and some of the officers. He said he had proof, evidence. He was going to report it, to expose them." He pauses, his voice filled with terror and sorrow. He never got the chance. The faded letters ink, the missing supplies, the whispers in the trenches, it all pointed to a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of the military. And Oscar Grant, a brave and honorable officer, had paid the ultimate price for uncovering the truth. The danger was greater than they expected. Chapter 6. The Sergeant Story. The revelation about the missing supplies and Oscar's investigation sent a chill down Claudia's spine. It confirmed their worst fears. Oscar had stumbled upon a dangerous conspiracy, and his death was almost certainly a deliberate act to silence him. But who were the officers involved? And how could they prove it? 3 years after the fact. "Arthur," Claudia said, her voice urgent. "Do you remember the names of any of the officers Oscar suspected? Anyone he mentioned specifically?" Arthur shook his head, his face etched with frustration. "No, he never mentioned names. He was careful, secretive. He said he couldn't trust anyone, not even me. He knew he was playing a dangerous game." He paused, his mind racing back to their time in France. But there was one man, a sergeant. Sergeant Miller. He was Oscar's right-hand man, his confidant. He might know something. He was with Oscar almost constantly, especially during those last few weeks. Sergeant Miller. A new name, a new lead. But finding him, after all this time, would be like searching for a needle in a haystack. The war had scattered soldiers across the country, across the world. "Do you know anything about him?" Claudia asked. "Where he was from, Anything that might help us find him? Arthur thought for a moment. He was from Ohio, I believe. A small town. I can't remember the name. He was a quiet man, reserved, but fiercely loyal to Oscar. He was a good soldier, a brave man. He paused, his eyes clouding with sadness. I haven't seen him since the war. I don't even know if he survived. Claudia felt a surge of determination. They had to find Sergeant Miller. He was their only hope, their only link to the truth. She returned to the War Department, her mind focused on her new task. She knew she had to be careful. If the conspiracy reached as high as she suspected, she could be putting herself in danger by asking too many questions. She decided to start with the personnel records, the restricted section that Mrs. Henderson had mentioned earlier. She knew she couldn't access them directly, but she might be able to find a way around the restrictions. She approached Mrs. Henderson, her heart pounding, her voice carefully casual. "Mrs. Henderson," she said, "I'm doing some research on military supply chains during the war." 4A report. Mrs. Henderson looked at her skeptically. "Supply chains? That's not your usual area, Miss Reed." Claudia forced a smile. "No, but I'm trying to broaden my knowledge. I was wondering if you could point me in the direction of any relevant records." Mrs. Henderson hesitated, her eyes narrowing. The personnel records might have some information on quartermasters, supply officers. But, as you know, access is restricted. Claudia took a deep breath. "I understand," she said. "But perhaps you could just give me a list of the names of the quartermasters and supply officers who served with the 12th Infantry Regiment during the Meuse-Argonne offensive. Just the names. I can do the rest of the research myself." Mrs. Henderson considered her request, her expression unreadable. Claudia held her breath, waiting for her decision. Finally, Mrs. Henderson nodded slowly. "Very well, Miss Reed," she said. "But I'm trusting you to be discreet. This information is sensitive." She led Claudia to a separate room, where the restricted personnel records were kept. She unlocked a cabinet and pulled out a thick ledger. She carefully copied down the names of the quartermasters and supply officers who had served with the 12th Infantry Regiment, handing the list to Claudia. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson," Claudia said, her voice trembling with relief. "I appreciate your help." She left the records room, her heart pounding with excitement. She had the names. Now, she had to find Sergeant Miller and hope that he could shed some light on the conspiracy that had cost Oscar Grant his life. She spent the next few days scouring the list, searching for any mention of Sergeant Miller. She cross-referenced the names with casualty lists, with veterans organizations, with any available records she could find. Finally, she found him. Sergeant Michael Miller, 12th Infantry Regiment. Wounded in action, Meuse-Argonne. Discharged, 1919. Address, a small town in Ohio, just as Arthur had remembered. Claudia felt a surge of hope. He was alive. And he was within reach. She knew she couldn't go to Ohio herself. It was too far, too expensive, and she couldn't risk taking time off work. She needed someone she could trust, someone who could discreetly interview Sergeant Miller and gather information. She thought of Arthur Blackwood. He was a veteran. He had served alongside Oscar and Sergeant Miller, and he had a personal stake in uncovering the truth. She contacted him, explaining her discovery, asking for his help. Arthur hesitated, his own fears and anxieties resurfacing. But he knew he couldn't refuse. He owed it to Oscar, to his memory, to find out what had happened. He agreed to travel to Ohio, to find Sergeant Miller, and to ask the questions that Claudia couldn't ask herself. He promised to be careful, to be discreet, and to report back with anything he found. Claudia waited, anxiously, for Arthur's return. The fate of their investigation, the hope of uncovering the truth about Oscar Grant's death, rested on the shoulders of a wounded sergeant, a man haunted by the memories of war, and a conspiracy that threatened to consume them all. The sergeant's story was the next piece of this puzzle, a piece that might either unlock everything or lead them into even greater danger. Chapter 7. Beneath the Cherry Blossoms. Arthur Blackwood returned from Ohio a week later, his face etched with a mixture of weariness and a strange, unsettling calm. He carried a small, worn notebook filled with his cramped handwriting, the record of his conversation with Sergeant Michael Miller. Claudia met him at Union Station, the grand, bustling railway station, a stark contrast to the quiet, rural town where Arthur had spent the past few days. The air was thick with the smell of coal smoke and the sounds of arriving and departing trains, a constant reminder of movement, of change, of lives intersecting and diverging. They found a quiet corner in a nearby cafe, the clatter of dishes and the murmur of conversations providing a backdrop of anonymity. Arthur sat down heavily, his movements stiff, his eyes shadowed. "He remembers," Arthur said, his voice low, his gaze fixed on the notebook in his hands. "He remembers everything." Claudia's heart pounded. "What did he say?" she asked, her voice urgent. Arthur opened the notebook, his fingers tracing the handwritten pages. He began to recount Sergeant Miller's story, his words painting a vivid picture of the final days of Lieutenant Oscar Grant. Sergeant Miller, as Arthur had described, was a quiet, reserved man, but fiercely loyal to Oscar. He had been with Oscar almost constantly during the Meuse-Argonne offensive, witnessing firsthand his growing concern about the missing supplies. Oscar was obsessed with it, Arthur said, reading from his notes. He spent hours poring over requisition forms, inventory lists, trying to find a pattern, a connection. He was convinced that something wasn't right, that someone was deliberately diverting supplies. Sergeant Miller had initially dismissed Oscar's concerns as the product of stress and exhaustion. The Meuse-Argonne was a brutal battle, a chaotic maelstrom of mud, blood, and constant bombardment. Soldiers were going hungry, going without ammunition, but that was the reality of war, the inevitable consequence of stretched supply lines and overwhelmed logistics. But Oscar had persisted, his investigation growing increasingly frantic, increasingly dangerous. He had started to ask questions, to probe, to challenge the authority of his superiors. He made enemies, Arthur said, his voice trembling. Powerful enemies. He was stepping on toes, threatening to expose something that someone wanted to keep hidden. Sergeant Miller had warned him, had begged him to stop, to let it go. But Oscar had refused. He was determined to uncover the truth, to bring the culprits to justice. And then it happened. The incident that had officially been recorded as an accidental death, a stray shell, a tragic consequence of war. But Sergeant Miller knew better. He had seen it with his own eyes. It wasn't an accident, Arthur said, his voice choked with emotion. It was deliberate. Oscar was shot in the back, not by enemy fire, but by one of our own. Claudia gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She had suspected murder, but to hear it confirmed, to hear the brutal details, was devastating. "Who?" she whispered. "Who shot him?" Arthur hesitated, his gaze shifting away. Sergeant Miller didn't see the shooter's face, he said. It was dark, chaotic. But he saw the uniform. It was an officer's uniform. And he heard the shot. It came from behind, from our own lines. An officer. The conspiracy reached even higher than they had imagined. But which officer?
And why?
Arthur continued reading from his notes, recounting Sergeant Miller's description of the aftermath. The chaos, the confusion, the attempts to cover up the truth, to silence any witnesses. Sergeant Miller was threatened, Arthur said. He was told to keep quiet, to forget what he had seen. He was wounded, shipped back to the States, and discharged. He's been living in fear ever since, afraid to speak out, afraid of the consequences. Claudia felt a surge of anger, of outrage. The injustice of it, the cruelty, was almost unbearable. Oscar Grant, a brave and honorable officer, had been murdered for uncovering the truth, and his killer had gone unpunished. We need to find the shooter, Claudia said, her voice firm, resolute. We need to bring him to justice. Arthur nodded, his eyes filled with a newfound determination. Sergeant Miller gave me a name, he said. A name he overheard, a name that was whispered in the aftermath of Oscar's death. Captain Randolph. Captain James Randolph. Captain Randolph. A new name, a new target. But who was he? And where was he now? As they left the cafe, the setting sun cast long shadows across the streets of Washington, D.C. The cherry blossoms, a symbol of renewal and hope, were in full bloom, their delicate pink petals fluttering in the breeze. But beneath the beauty, beneath the surface, a darkness lurked, a conspiracy that had claimed the life of an innocent man and that threatened to consume them all. Chapter 8. Scars of the Somme. Captain James Randolph. The name echoed in Claudia's mind, a chilling reminder of the task ahead. She knew she had to find him, to uncover his role in Oscar Grant's death, to bring him to justice. But where to start? She returned to the War Department, her mind racing with possibilities. She knew she had to be careful, discreet. If Captain Randolph was involved in the conspiracy, he could be dangerous, powerful. She couldn't risk alerting him to her investigation. She started with the personnel records, searching for any information on Captain James Randolph. She found his file, a thick, detailed record of his military career. He was a decorated officer, a veteran of several major battles, including the Somme, where he had been wounded and received a medal for bravery. His record was impressive, almost impeccable. He had risen through the ranks quickly, earning promotions and accolades. He was currently assigned to the Quartermaster Corps, a position that gave him access to supplies, to logistics, to the very heart of the military's operations. Claudia felt a chill run down her spine. It was a perfect fit. Captain Randolph had the motive, the opportunity, and the access to carry out the conspiracy that Oscar Grant had uncovered. She studied his photograph, a formal portrait taken shortly after his promotion to captain. He was a handsome man, with a strong jawline, piercing eyes, and a confident, almost arrogant expression. He looked like a man who was used to getting his way, a man who wouldn't hesitate to use his power to protect his interests. But there was something else in his eyes, a hint of darkness, of something hidden beneath the surface. Was it the trauma of war? Or was it something more sinister? Claudia knew she couldn't rely on his personnel file alone. She needed to find out more about him, about his personality, his relationships, his reputation. She needed to dig deeper, to uncover the secrets that he had so carefully concealed. She decided to talk to some of the other employees at the War Department, the clerks, the typists, the secretaries who had worked with Captain Randolph, who might have observed him, overheard conversations, noticed anything unusual. She started with Mrs. Henderson, the head archivist, who had access to a wealth of information, both official and unofficial. Mrs. Henderson, Claudia said, her voice carefully casual. I'm doing some research on decorated officers. For a project. Mrs. Henderson looked at her skeptically. Decorated officers? Again, Miss Reed. That's not your usual area. Claudia forced a smile. No, but I'm trying to expand my horizons. I was wondering if you could tell me anything about Captain James Randolph. He seems to have a rather impressive record. Mrs. Henderson hesitated, her eyes narrowing. Captain Randolph, she murmured. Yes, he's a well-respected officer. A bit of a stickler for rules, but very efficient. Very ambitious. She paused, her gaze shifting away. There were some rumors a few years ago about his time in France. During the Somme, Claudia's heart pounded. Rumors? What kind of rumors? Mrs. Henderson hesitated again, her expression uneasy. Nothing specific. Just whispers. About his conduct. About his methods. Some said he was ruthless. That he would do anything to achieve his goals. Ruthless. The word resonated with Claudia. It confirmed her suspicions about Captain Randolph, about his willingness to use his power to silence anyone who threatened him. She continued her investigation, talking to other employees, gathering snippets of information, piecing together a portrait of Captain Randolph that was far more complex, far more disturbing than his official record suggested. She learned that he was a demanding, often intimidating boss, that he had a reputation for being cold, aloof, and unforgiving. He was known for his meticulous attention to detail, his obsession with control, and his intolerance for mistakes. She also learned that he had a close relationship with several high-ranking officers, that he was often seen socializing with them, attending parties, and engaging in confidential conversations. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place. Captain Randolph was a man with a dark past, a ruthless ambition, and powerful connections. He was the perfect candidate for the mastermind behind the conspiracy that had cost Oscar Grant his life. But Claudia knew she needed more than circumstantial evidence. She needed proof, concrete evidence that would link Captain Randolph to Oscar's murder. As she delved deeper into his past, she uncovered a disturbing incident from his time at the Somme. A report, buried deep within the archives, detailed an investigation into allegations of misconduct against Captain Randolph. He had been accused of ordering his men to fire on unarmed prisoners, a war crime that could have resulted in his court-martial. The investigation had been inconclusive, the witnesses unreliable, the evidence circumstantial. Captain Randolph had been cleared of all charges, his reputation seemingly intact. But the report remained, a stain on his record, a hint of the darkness that lurked beneath the surface. Claudia felt a surge of hope. This could be the key, the evidence she needed to expose Captain Randolph, to bring him to justice. The scars of the Somme, the hidden truths of his past, were beginning to reveal the true nature of the man who had ordered the death of Lieutenant Oscar Grant. The web was tightening, and Claudia was closing in. Chapter 9. The Telegram's Omen. The discovery of the suppressed report on Captain Randolph's alleged war crime during the Somme offensive was a significant breakthrough. It provided a crucial link between Randolph and a history of ruthless behavior, a pattern of disregarding rules and potentially engaging in deadly actions to achieve his goals. However, Claudia knew that even this damning report wasn't enough to definitively prove his involvement in Oscar Grant's murder. She needed something more concrete, a direct connection. Claudia decided to revisit Eleanor Grant, hoping that perhaps, in her grief and shock, Eleanor might have overlooked some detail, some clue that could shed further light on Oscar's suspicions and his final days. She found Eleanor at home, the house still shrouded in a palpable sense of mourning. The badge, now prominently displayed on a small table in the parlor, served as a constant reminder of Oscar's absence and the unresolved mystery surrounding his death. "Eleanor," Claudia began gently, "I know this is difficult, but I need to ask you again about Oscar's last letter. You said he mentioned a conspiracy, a betrayal. Did he give you any indication of who might be involved? Any names, any places, anything at all?" Eleanor closed her eyes, her face etched with pain as she struggled to recall the details of that terrifying time. I don't know," she whispered. "I burned the letter, just as he asked. I was so scared, I just wanted to forget." She paused, her brow furrowed in concentration. But there was something. He mentioned a telegram. He said he had received a telegram that worried him. He said it was cryptic coded. He didn't understand it, but he felt it was an omen. A warning. A telegram. Claudia's heart quickened. A coded message, sent just before Oscar's death. It could be the key, the missing piece of the puzzle. "Do you remember anything about the telegram?" Claudia asked urgently. "Who sent it? Where it came from? Anything at all?" Eleanor shook her head, her eyes filled with frustration. "I don't know. I didn't see it. He mentioned it in the letter. He said he was going to try to decipher it, to find out what it meant." Claudia felt a surge of frustration. Another dead end? Not quite. If Oscar had received a telegram, there would be a record of it. Somewhere. She returned to the War Department, her mind focused on a new target, the telegraph office. Every message sent and received during the war had been meticulously logged, archived, and stored. If Oscar had received a coded telegram, there would be a copy of it, somewhere in the vast labyrinth of records. She knew she couldn't access the telegraph records directly. They were highly classified, even more restricted than the personnel files. She needed a different approach, a way to circumvent the usual protocols. She thought of Mrs. Henderson, the head archivist. She had been helpful before, surprisingly sympathetic to Claudia's requests. Perhaps she could be persuaded to help again, to bend the rules, to provide access to the restricted records. Claudia approached her cautiously, her heart pounding, her voice carefully modulated.
"Mrs. Henderson," she said.
"I need your help again. This is important. It's about Lieutenant Grant and Captain Randolph." Mrs. Henderson looked at her, her eyes narrowed, her expression wary. She knew that Claudia was digging deeper, that she was venturing into dangerous territory. "Miss Reed,
she said softly.
I'm not sure I can help you. The telegraph records are highly classified. Access is strictly prohibited. Claudia took a deep breath. I know, she said. But I believe Lieutenant Grant was murdered. And I believe Captain Randolph was involved. There's a telegram, a coded message that could be the key to proving it. She looked at Mrs. Henderson, her eyes pleading.
Please, she said.
Help me find it. Help me bring justice to Lieutenant Grant. Mrs. Henderson hesitated, her gaze shifting away, her mind clearly wrestling with the implications of Claudia's request. She knew the risks, the potential consequences. But she also knew that Claudia was driven by a sense of justice, by a determination to uncover the truth. Finally, she nodded slowly. Very well, Miss Reed, she said. But we must be extremely careful. This could have serious repercussions. She led Claudia to a hidden room, deep within the bowels of the War Department, a place where the most sensitive, the most classified, records were kept. The air was thick with the smell of dust and old paper, the silence broken only by the faint hum of the building's ventilation system. Mrs. Henderson unlocked a massive steel door, revealing a vast chamber filled with towering shelves, crammed with bound ledgers, boxes, and files. This was the heart of the War Department's secrets, the repository of its most hidden truths. The telegraph records are organized by date and time, Mrs. Henderson said. We need to know when Lieutenant Grant received the message. Claudia thought back to Eleanor's account.
It was a few weeks before his death, she said.
Late October, 1918. They began to search, their fingers flying over the dusty ledgers, their eyes scanning the faded ink, the cryptic abbreviations, the coded messages. Hours passed, the silence broken only by the rustle of pages and the occasional muttered curse. Finally, Mrs. Henderson let out a small gasp. Here it is, she said, pointing to a line in a ledger dated October 25, 1918. Telegram received. Lieutenant Oscar Grant, 12th Infantry Regiment. Meuse Argonne. Coded message. Claudia's heart pounded. They had found it. The telegram's omen, the warning that Oscar Grant had received just days before his death. But what did it say? And who sent it? The answer to those questions could unlock the entire conspiracy. Chapter 10. A Dance of Shadows. The coded telegram was a string of seemingly random letters and numbers, a jumble of characters that made no sense to Claudia. Deciphering it would require expertise, a knowledge of wartime codes and ciphers that she simply didn't possess. We need a cryptographer, Claudia said to Mrs. Henderson, her voice filled with a mixture of excitement and frustration. Someone who can break the code, who can tell us what this message means. Mrs. Henderson nodded, her brow furrowed in thought. There are cryptographers who work for the War Department, she said. But they're highly vetted, highly trusted. We can't just approach one of them and ask for their help. It would raise too many suspicions. Claudia understood the risk. If Captain Randolph or someone connected to him discovered their investigation, they could be in serious danger. They needed to find a cryptographer outside the War Department, someone discreet, trustworthy, and skilled enough to break the code without revealing its contents to the wrong people. I know someone, Mrs. Henderson said suddenly, her voice barely a whisper. A former employee. He worked in the cryptography department during the war. He was brilliant, but he left under a cloud. He had disagreements with his superiors. He was disillusioned. She paused, her gaze shifting away. His name is Mr. Silas Blackwood. He is Arthur's brother. Claudia's eyes widened. Arthur Blackwood's brother? A disillusioned cryptographer? It was a long shot, but it was their only hope. Where can we find him? Claudia asked. Mrs. Henderson hesitated. He lives a secluded life, she said. He doesn't like to be disturbed. He's bitter. But he might be willing to help. For Oscar's sake. She gave Claudia his address, a small, isolated cottage on the outskirts of Arlington. She warned her to be careful, to be discreet. Mr. Silas Blackwood was a volatile, unpredictable man, haunted by his own demons. Claudia contacted Arthur, explaining the situation, asking for his help in approaching his brother. Arthur was hesitant, reluctant to involve Silas in their dangerous investigation. He knew his brother was a fragile, troubled man, capable of both brilliance and self-destruction. "He's not well, Claudia," Arthur said, his voice filled with concern. "He's been through a lot. The war, it affected him deeply. He's not the same man he used to be." But Arthur also knew that Silas was their only hope. He agreed to accompany Claudia, to introduce her to his brother, to vouch for her trustworthiness. They traveled to the cottage, a small, dilapidated structure hidden amidst a tangle of overgrown trees and bushes. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, the silence broken only by the rustling of the wind through the branches. Arthur knocked on the door, his hand trembling slightly. A few moments passed, and Claudia was about to suggest they leave when the door creaked open, revealing a man standing in the shadows. It was Silas Blackwood, but he was a far cry from the polished, confident image of his brother. He was thin, almost gaunt, with wild, unkempt hair and a haunted look in his eyes. He was wearing a stained, rumpled suit, his clothes hanging loosely on his frame. "Arthur?" he said, his voice raspy, his gaze wary. "What are you doing here?" Arthur explained their presence, introducing Claudia, explaining their investigation into Oscar Grant's death and their need for Silas's expertise in deciphering the coded telegram. Silas listened in silence, his expression unreadable. He stared at Claudia, his eyes piercing, probing, as if trying to assess her trustworthiness, her motives. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Show me the message," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Claudia handed him a copy of the telegram, her hand trembling slightly. Silas took it, his fingers tracing the coded characters, his eyes narrowing in concentration. He led them inside the cottage, a cluttered, chaotic space filled with books, papers, and strange, arcane devices. The air was thick with the smell of dust and stale tobacco, the silence broken only by the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Silas sat down at a small, rickety table, spreading the telegram out in front of him. He began to work, his fingers flying over the coded message, his mind racing, his eyes focused, intense. Hours passed, the silence broken only by the occasional muttered word, the scratch of a pen on paper, the rustle of pages. Claudia and Arthur watched him, their anticipation growing with each passing moment. Finally, Silas looked up, his eyes filled with a strange mixture of triumph and despair. "I've broken it," he said, his voice hoarse. "I know what it says." Claudia leaned forward, her heart pounding.
"What?
What does it mean?" Silas took a deep breath, his hands shaking.
"It's a warning," he said.
"A warning to Oscar. It says they know. Stop investigating. Randolph is dangerous. Leave immediately." Claudia gasped. The telegram confirmed their suspicions. Captain Randolph was indeed involved in the conspiracy, and Oscar Grant had been murdered to silence him. But who sent the warning? Who was trying to help Oscar?
"Who sent it?"
Claudia asked urgently. "Is there any indication of the sender?" Silas shook his head, his eyes filled with frustration.
"No," he said.
"The code is unbreakable. It's a one-time pad, a system that's virtually impossible to crack without the key. The sender remains anonymous. An anonymous warning, a desperate attempt to save Oscar Grant's life. But it had come too late. The dance of shadows, the conspiracy that had claimed Oscar's life, was still shrouded in mystery. Chapter 11. The Stolen Kiss. The deciphered telegram, while confirming Captain Randolph's involvement and revealing a desperate attempt to warn Oscar, left a crucial question unanswered. Who was the anonymous sender? The mystery deepened, and Claudia felt a growing sense of urgency. They were close to the truth, but they needed one final piece of the puzzle to expose the entire conspiracy. Claudia and Arthur decided to focus their attention on Captain Randolph himself. They needed to find concrete evidence linking him to Oscar's murder, something more than circumstantial evidence and a coded message. They began to investigate his movements, his contacts, his activities in the days leading up to Oscar's death. They knew it was a long shot, but they had to try. They revisited the War Department records, poring over requisition forms, supply logs, personnel assignments, searching for any anomaly, any discrepancy, any clue that might connect Randolph to the missing supplies and Oscar's investigation. They also decided to interview some of the soldiers who had served under Captain Randolph during the Meuse-Argonne offensive, hoping that someone might have witnessed something suspicious, overheard a conversation, noticed anything unusual. It was a slow, painstaking process, fraught with frustration and dead ends. Most of the soldiers were reluctant to talk, their memories clouded by the trauma of war, their loyalty to their former commanding officers still strong. But one soldier, a former corporal named Thomas Evans, no relation to Claudia's deceased fiancé, provided a glimmer of hope. He remembered Captain Randolph being unusually agitated in the days leading up to Oscar's death, overheard him having heated arguments with another officer, a colonel named Matthews.
Colonel Matthews.
A new name, a new potential player in the conspiracy. Claudia felt a surge of excitement. This could be the break they needed. They investigated Colonel Matthews, discovering that he was a high-ranking officer in the Quartermaster Corps, Captain Randolph's direct superior. He had a reputation for being ambitious, ruthless, and closely connected to powerful figures in Washington. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place. Captain Randolph and Colonel Matthews, working together, diverting supplies, profiting from the war, and silencing anyone who threatened to expose them. Oscar Grant had stumbled upon their scheme, and they had murdered him to protect their interests. But they still needed proof, concrete evidence that would link them to the crime. Claudia decided to take a risk, a bold, dangerous gamble. She decided to confront Captain Randolph directly, to accuse him of Oscar's murder, to see if she could provoke him into revealing something, anything, that would incriminate him. She knew it was a dangerous move. Captain Randolph was a powerful, ruthless man, and he wouldn't hesitate to silence her if he felt threatened. But she was running out of time, running out of options. She arranged a meeting with him, using her position at the War Department as a pretext. She claimed she needed to discuss some discrepancies in the supply records, some irregularities that had come to her attention. Captain Randolph agreed to meet her, his voice cold, formal, over the telephone. Claudia's heart pounded as she prepared for the confrontation, her mind racing, her body tense with anticipation and fear. She met him in his office, a spacious, imposing room filled with military memorabilia, awards, and photographs. He was sitting behind a large, mahogany desk, his expression unreadable, his eyes cold and calculating. "Miss Reed," he said, his voice devoid of warmth. "What is this about?" "I'm a busy man." Claudia took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly. "It's about Lieutenant Oscar Grant," she said, her voice firm, resolute. "And his murder." Captain Randolph's eyes narrowed, his expression hardening. "Lieutenant Grant's death was a tragic accident," he said. "A casualty of war. I suggest you not speak such slander." Claudia stood her ground. "It wasn't an accident," she said. "He was murdered. And you were involved." She recounted everything she had learned, the missing supplies, the coded telegram, Sergeant Miller's testimony, the suppressed report from the Somme. Captain Randolph listened in silence, his face impassive, his eyes betraying nothing. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips. "You have no proof," he said. "Just rumors, speculation, and the ravings of a disgruntled sergeant." Claudia felt a surge of anger, of frustration. He was denying everything, stonewalling her, confident in his power, in his ability to escape justice. She decided to take one final, desperate gamble. She stepped closer to his desk, her eyes locked on his, her voice low and intense. "I know about Colonel Matthews," she said. "I know about your partnership, your scheme. I know you were both involved in Oscar's murder." Captain Randolph's smirk vanished, his eyes widening slightly, his face paling. He had been caught off guard, his carefully constructed facade cracking. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor, his voice rising in anger. "You have no right," he said. "You have no proof. You're making wild accusations." He stepped towards her, his eyes filled with menace, his hand reaching out as if to grab her. Claudia stood her ground, refusing to be intimidated. In that moment, something unexpected happened. As Captain Randolph reached for her, their eyes met, and for a fleeting second, She saw something flicker in his gaze. Not anger, not fear, but something else. Regret? Remorse? He hesitated, his hand hovering in the air, his body trembling slightly. And then he did something even more unexpected. He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, a stolen kiss, a brief, desperate act of what?
Desire?
Desperation? A final, futile attempt to silence her? Claudia was stunned, shocked, her body frozen in place. The kiss was over as quickly as it began, leaving her breathless, confused, and strangely shaken. Captain Randolph stepped back, his face flushed, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and defiance. "Get out," he said, his voice hoarse. "Get out of my office." Claudia didn't hesitate. She turned and fled, her heart pounding, her mind racing. The stolen kiss, the unexpected act of vulnerability, had changed everything. It was a confession of sorts, an admission of guilt, a sign of weakness in a man who had always prided himself on his strength, his control. But what did it mean? And how could she use it to bring him to justice? Chapter 12. The Price of Honor. The stolen kiss, so unexpected and unsettling, left Claudia reeling. It was a jarring intrusion, a violation, but also a crack in Captain Randolph's carefully constructed facade. It suggested a vulnerability, a hidden turmoil beneath his cold, calculating exterior. She wasn't sure what it meant, but she knew it was significant, a potential turning point in her investigation. She returned to the boarding house, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. The kiss replayed in her mind, the feel of his lips on hers, the brief, intense pressure, the mixture of anger, confusion, and a strange, unexpected flicker of something else. She couldn't quite define it, but it was there, a disturbing undercurrent that both repelled and intrigued her. Mrs. Peterson, ever observant, noticed Claudia's disheveled appearance and agitated state. "Miss Reed," she said, her voice sharp with concern. "Are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." Claudia forced a smile, trying to regain her composure. "I'm fine, Mrs. Peterson," she said. "Just a long day at the War Department." She hurried up to her room, locking the door behind her, needing time to process what had happened, to make sense of Captain Randolph's actions, to decide on her next move. She sat down at her small desk, the badge still lying there, a constant reminder of her promise to Oscar Grant. She picked it up, turning it over and over in her hands, the cold metal a grounding presence amidst the turmoil of her emotions. She realized that the kiss, while disturbing, had given her leverage. It was a sign of weakness, a crack in Captain Randolph's armor. He had lost control, however briefly, and that loss of control could be his undoing. She decided to use it. She would confront him again, but this time, she would be armed with the knowledge of his vulnerability, his hidden turmoil. She would use the kiss, his act of desperation, to push him, to pressure him, to force him to confess. But she also knew that she needed to be careful. Captain Randolph was still a dangerous man, a powerful man. He wouldn't hesitate to retaliate if he felt cornered. She decided to seek Arthur Blackwood's advice and support. He had been a steadfast ally throughout her investigation, and she trusted his judgment, his instincts. She met him the following day at the National Cemetery, a place that had become their sanctuary, their meeting ground, a symbol of their shared grief and their determination to find justice for Oscar Grant. She recounted the encounter with Captain Randolph, the stolen kiss, her belief that it was a sign of weakness, a potential breakthrough. Arthur listened in silence, his face etched with concern, his eyes filled with a mixture of apprehension and understanding. "It's risky, Claudia," he said, his voice low. "He's a desperate man. He could be dangerous." Claudia nodded.
"I know," she said.
"But I think it's our best chance. He's cracking. I can feel it." Arthur hesitated, then nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "I'll be there with you. I won't let him hurt you." They arranged to meet Captain Randolph again, this time at a neutral location, a small, discreet cafe near the War Department. Claudia chose the location carefully, ensuring that there would be witnesses, people who could intervene if things got out of hand. She sent Captain Randolph a message, requesting another meeting, claiming she had new information about the supply discrepancies. He agreed, his response terse, guarded. They met him at the cafe, the clatter of dishes and the murmur of conversations providing a backdrop of normalcy that belied the tension in the air. Captain Randolph was already there, sitting at a corner table, his face impassive, his eyes cold and calculating. Claudia and Arthur sat down opposite him, the small table a barrier between them, a symbol of the conflict that was about to unfold. "Miss Reed," Captain Randolph said, his voice devoid of warmth. "You said you had new information." Claudia took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly. "I do," she said. "But first, I want to talk about yesterday."
About the kiss.
Captain Randolph's eyes narrowed, his expression hardening. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. Claudia held his gaze, refusing to be intimidated.
"You do," she said.
"You kissed me. It was a mistake, a moment of weakness. And it tells me everything I need to know." She leaned forward, her voice low and intense. "You're guilty, Captain Randolph. You were involved in Oscar Grant's murder. And I'm going to prove it." Captain Randolph's face flushed, his hands clenching into fists. "You have no proof," he said, his voice rising. "You're making wild accusations." Arthur intervened, his voice calm but firm.
"Captain Randolph," he said.
"We know about the missing supplies. We know about Colonel Matthews. We know about the coded telegram. We know you were involved." Captain Randolph glared at them, his eyes filled with anger and a flicker of fear. He was trapped, cornered, his carefully constructed facade crumbling around him. And then something unexpected happened. He slumped back in his chair, his shoulders sagging, his head bowed. The fight seemed to drain out of him, replaced by a weary resignation. "It was Matthews," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "He was the one who ordered it. I just followed orders." Claudia and Arthur exchanged a stunned look. A confession of sorts, but not a complete one. He was trying to shift the blame, to minimize his own involvement. "You were involved, Captain Randolph," Claudia said, her voice firm. "You knew what was happening. You could have stopped it. You could have saved Oscar's life." Captain Randolph looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and regret. "I was afraid," he whispered. He was powerful, connected. "I had no choice. The price of honor, the cost of silence, the burden of guilt." Captain Randolph, a decorated officer, a man of ambition and power, had been reduced to a broken, defeated figure, his life shattered by the consequences of his choices. He had chosen to save himself. He chose to follow orders instead of his conscience. Chapter 13. Betrayal's Bitter Sting. Captain Randolph's partial confession, while a significant step forward, was far from the complete truth. He had implicated Colonel Matthews as the mastermind behind the conspiracy and Oscar Grant's murder, but he continued to downplay his own role, claiming he had merely followed orders out of fear. Claudia knew there was more to the story, that Randolph was still holding back, protecting himself, or perhaps someone else. "Captain Randolph," Claudia said, her voice firm but laced with a hint of compassion, "I understand you were afraid. But you have a chance now to make things right. To tell the whole truth. To help us bring justice to Oscar and to everyone else who suffered because of this conspiracy." Randolph hesitated, his eyes darting around the cafe, as if searching for an escape, a way out of the corner he had painted himself into. He looked at Arthur, a flicker of pleading in his gaze, a silent appeal for understanding, perhaps even for forgiveness. Arthur, who had served alongside Randolph and had once respected him, met his gaze with a mixture of sadness and disappointment. "It's over, James," Arthur said softly. "Tell the truth. It's the only way to find any peace." Randolph closed his eyes, his body trembling slightly. He took a deep breath, as if steeling himself for a painful confession. When he opened his eyes, they were filled with a weary resignation, a sense of defeat that went beyond the fear of prosecution. "It wasn't just Matthews," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "There were others. Higher up. Much higher up." Claudia's heart pounded. The conspiracy reached even further than she had imagined. It wasn't just a few rogue officers. but a network of corruption that extended into the highest echelons of the military, perhaps even into the government itself. Who? Claudia asked urgently. Who else was involved? Randolph hesitated again, his gaze shifting nervously. He was clearly terrified, afraid of the consequences of revealing the names of such powerful individuals. I can't, he whispered. They'll kill me. They'll kill anyone who knows. Claudia leaned forward, her voice low and insistent.
We can protect you, she said.
We can get you into protective custody. We can expose them, bring them to justice. But you have to tell us everything. Randolph shook his head, his eyes filled with despair. It's not that simple, he said. They have eyes everywhere. They control everything. There's no escape. He looked at Claudia, a flicker of desperation in his gaze. There's one person, he said. One person who might know the whole truth. Someone who is close to Matthews. Someone who might have evidence. He paused, his voice dropping to a whisper. Her name is Evelyn Reed. She has no relation with me. Evelyn Reed. Claudia's heart skipped a beat. Another Reed? Was this woman related to her in any manner? The coincidence was striking, unsettling. But Randolph had specified that they were not. Who is she? Claudia asked, her voice trembling slightly. What was her connection to Colonel Matthews? Randolph hesitated again, his gaze shifting away. She was his mistress, he said, his voice barely audible.
She was also a spy.
Working for the other side.
A spy?
A mistress? The conspiracy took another unexpected turn, revealing a web of betrayal, deception, and espionage that went far beyond the simple theft of military supplies. Where is she now? Claudia asked urgently. Where can we find her? Randolph shook his head.
I don't know, he said.
She disappeared after Matthews died. I haven't seen her since. Matthews was dead? Claudia hadn't known that. It added another layer of complexity to the investigation, another obstacle to uncovering the truth. Matthews died shortly after the war ended. Randolph continued. Officially, it was a heart attack. But I always suspected foul play. Claudia felt a surge of frustration. Another dead end? Or was it? Evelyn Reed, the spy, the mistress, the potential witness, she was still out there, somewhere. And she might hold the key to unlocking the entire conspiracy. Betrayal's bitter sting, the taste of deception, the weight of hidden truths. The investigation had taken Claudia on a perilous journey, revealing a web of corruption, murder, and espionage that reached the highest levels of power. She had faced danger, intimidation, and heartbreak, but she was still determined to find justice for Oscar Grant, to expose the truth, no matter the cost. But the question that now nagged at her was this. Who had been betraying whom? Was Evelyn a double agent? Was Matthews? The layers of this mystery seemed endless, each answer only leading to more questions. Chapter 14. The Hospital's Lullaby. The revelation of Evelyn Reed, Colonel Matthews' mistress, and a suspected spy, added a new dimension of intrigue and danger to the already complex investigation. Claudia knew she had to find her, to uncover her role in the conspiracy, and to determine whether she held the key to exposing the truth about Oscar Grant's murder. But where to start? Evelyn Reed had disappeared after Colonel Matthews' death, leaving no trace, no forwarding address, no indication of her whereabouts. She was a ghost, a phantom figure who had vanished into the ether. Claudia decided to start with the obvious. Colonel Matthews himself. Even though he was dead, there might be clues in his past, in his personal life, in his connections, that could lead her to Evelyn. She returned to the War Department, her mind focused on a new target, Colonel Matthews' personnel file. She knew it was a long shot, but she had to try. She had to find something, anything that could connect him to Evelyn Reed. She approached Mrs. Henderson, the head archivist, her heart pounding, her voice carefully modulated. Mrs. Henderson, she said, I need your help again. It's about Colonel Matthews. Mrs. Henderson looked at her, her eyes narrowed, her expression wary. She knew that Claudia was digging deeper, that she was venturing into even more dangerous territory. Miss Reed, she said softly, Colonel Matthews was a powerful man. His file is highly sensitive. Access is extremely restricted. Claudia took a deep breath.
I know, she said.
But I believe he was involved in Lieutenant Grant's murder. And I believe there's a woman named Evelyn Reed who might have information. She was his mistress. Mrs. Henderson's eyes widened slightly, her expression betraying a flicker of surprise. She clearly knew something, had heard rumors, perhaps even seen Evelyn Reed herself. Evelyn Reed, she murmured. Yes, I remember the name. There were whispers about her and the colonel. She hesitated, her gaze shifting away, her mind clearly wrestling with the implications of Claudia's request. She knew the risks, the potential consequences. But she also knew that Claudia was driven by a sense of justice, by a determination to uncover the truth. Finally, she nodded slowly. Very well, Miss Reed, she said. But we must be even more careful than before. This could have catastrophic repercussions. She led Claudia back to the hidden room, the repository of the War Department's most sensitive secrets. She unlocked the massive steel door, revealing the vast chamber filled with towering shelves, crammed with bound ledgers, boxes, and files. She located Colonel Matthews' personnel file, a thick, imposing document filled with details of his military career, his promotions, his commendations, and his personal life. Claudia began to search, her fingers flying over the pages, her eyes scanning the faded ink, the formal language, the cryptic abbreviations. She found nothing about Evelyn Reed, nothing that connected him to a mistress, to a spy. Just as she was about to give up, Mrs. Henderson pointed to a small, almost hidden section at the back of the file. There, she said, the personal correspondence. It was a collection of letters, telegrams, and notes, mostly mundane, routine communications. But one letter caught Claudia's eye. It was addressed to Colonel Matthews, but the handwriting was different, unfamiliar. It was signed simply, E. Claudia carefully unfolded the letter, her hands trembling slightly. The paper was thin, almost translucent, the ink faded but still legible. It was a love letter, a passionate, intimate message from a woman to her lover. It spoke of their secret meetings, their forbidden desires, their shared dreams. It was signed Evelyn. Claudia's heart pounded. She had found her. Evelyn Reed, the mistress, the spy, the potential witness. But the letter revealed something else, something even more surprising. Evelyn wasn't just Colonel Matthews' mistress. She was also working for him. She was his informant, his agent, his spy within the enemy's ranks. The letter spoke of her missions, her assignments, her dangerous liaisons. She was gathering information, stealing secrets, betraying her country for the man she loved. But the letter also revealed a growing sense of unease, a hint of doubt, a flicker of conscience. Evelyn was starting to question her actions, to question her loyalty, to question her love for Colonel Matthews. The final paragraph of the letter was chilling. I don't know how much longer I can do this, James, Evelyn wrote.
I'm afraid.
I'm afraid of what we've become. I'm afraid of the consequences. I'm thinking of leaving, disappearing, starting a new life. Disappearing. That's exactly what she had done.
But where? And why?
Claudia felt a surge of hope. Evelyn Reed wasn't just a spy, a mistress. She was a woman trapped in a dangerous game, a woman torn between love and duty, a woman who might be willing to help, to expose the truth. She knew she had to find her, but time was running out. As she left the War Department, a chilling realization dawned on her. If Evelyn was a spy, and Matthews was dead, perhaps by foul play, then Evelyn's life was in grave danger. The others Randolph had mentioned might be looking for her, too. Claudia decided to check hospitals. If Evelyn had been injured, or if she had sought refuge, she might have used a false name. It was a long shot, but it was all she had. She started with the military hospitals in and around Arlington, checking patient records, admission logs, anything that might provide a clue. Days turned into nights, and the search seemed fruitless. But then, at a small, almost forgotten hospital on the outskirts of town, she found something. A record of a woman admitted under a false name, suffering from a gunshot wound, shortly after Colonel Matthews' death. The description, it matched Evelyn's. Claudia rushed to the hospital, her heart pounding with anticipation and fear. She found the nurse who had been on duty at the time of the woman's admission. The nurse remembered her, a beautiful, mysterious woman who had been terrified, desperate, and alone. She left, the nurse said, discharged herself. Against medical advice. She said she had to disappear. She said they were after her.
They.
The others. The conspiracy was still active, still hunting its enemies, still silencing anyone who knew the truth. Claudia had to find Evelyn Reed before it was too late. The hospital's lullaby, the echoes of pain and fear, were a stark reminder of the danger that surrounded them all. Chapter 15. Beyond the barbed wire. The nurse's confirmation that Evelyn Reed had been in the hospital, injured and terrified, fueled Claudia's determination. She knew Evelyn was alive, but on the run, hunted by the shadowy figures behind the conspiracy. The challenge now was to find her before they did. Claudia reasoned that Evelyn, knowing she was a target, would likely seek refuge somewhere far from Arlington, somewhere she could disappear and start a new life. She would need money, resources, and a place to hide. Thinking back to the coded telegram, the one sent to Oscar Grant as a warning, Claudia wondered if the sender might be the key to finding Evelyn. The message they know. Stop investigating. Randolph is dangerous. Leave immediately, suggested someone with intimate knowledge of the conspiracy and a desire to protect Oscar. Could this same person have helped Evelyn escape? The code used in the telegram, a one-time pad, was unbreakable without the key. But the fact that someone had used such a sophisticated method suggested a connection to intelligence circles, perhaps even to the War Department itself. Silas Blackwood, with his background in cryptography, might be able to offer some insight, even if he couldn't identify the sender. Claudia decided to pay Silas another visit. She found him at his secluded cottage, surrounded by his books, papers, and enigmatic devices. He seemed even more withdrawn and troubled than before, his eyes haunted by the ghosts of his past. Silas, Claudia said, her voice gentle but urgent, I need your help again. It's about the telegram, the one you deciphered. The warning to Oscar Grant. Silas looked at her, his expression wary, his gaze flickering with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. What about it? He asked, his voice raspy. Claudia explained her theory, her belief that the sender of the telegram might have also helped Evelyn Reed escape. She asked him if there was anything at all, about the message, the code, the context that could provide a clue to the sender's identity or whereabouts. Silas hesitated, his mind clearly wrestling with the implications of her request. He knew the dangers involved, the risks of delving back into the secrets of the war. Finally, he nodded slowly. There's one thing, he said, his voice barely a whisper. The paper. The telegram was written on a specific type of paper. Very rare. Very expensive. Used only by a few select departments within the War Department. Claudia's heart quickened. Which departments? She asked urgently. Silas hesitated again, his gaze shifting away. The Intelligence Division, he said. And the Office of the Secretary of War. The Intelligence Division. And the Office of the Secretary of War. The conspiracy reached the highest levels of power, confirming Randolph's terrified claims. But it also narrowed down the possibilities, providing a potential link to Evelyn Reed's escape. Claudia reasoned that if Evelyn had been working as a spy for Colonel Matthews, she might have had contacts within the Intelligence Division, people who knew her, who trusted her, who might have been willing to help her. She decided to return to the War Department, one last time, to search for any records, any personnel files, any connections between Evelyn Reed and the Intelligence Division. She knew it was a dangerous gamble, that she was risking exposure, but she had to try. She had to find Evelyn before it was too late. She knew she couldn't rely on Mrs. Henderson this time. The risk was too great, the potential consequences too severe. She had to find another way, a way to access the restricted records without alerting anyone to her investigation. She remembered a young clerk, a quiet, unassuming man named Thomas Evans again, another Thomas Evans, with no relation, who worked in the records room. He had been helpful before, providing information on Captain Randolph, seemingly sympathetic to her quest for justice. He might be willing to help again, to bend the rules, to provide access to the restricted files. She approached him cautiously, her heart pounding, her voice carefully modulated.
Thomas, she said.
I need your help. It's about Evelyn Reed and the Intelligence Division. Thomas looked at her, his eyes widening slightly, his expression betraying a flicker of fear. He knew the dangers involved, the risks of accessing such sensitive information. But he also knew that Claudia was driven by a sense of justice, by a determination to uncover the truth. He had seen her persistence, her courage, her unwavering commitment to finding justice for Oscar Grant. He nodded slowly. I can try, he said, his voice barely a whisper. But we must be extremely careful. This could cost us our jobs. Or worse. He led her to a hidden section of the records room, a place where the most classified, the most sensitive, files were kept. He unlocked a cabinet, revealing a collection of personnel files, all marked with the insignia of the Intelligence Division. They began to search, their fingers flying over the pages, their eyes scanning the names, the photographs, the service records. Hours passed, the silence broken only by the rustle of paper and the occasional whispered word. Finally, they found her. Evelyn Reed. Intelligence Division. Agent. Code name, Nightingale. Her file was thin, almost empty, most of the information redacted, blacked out. But there was enough to confirm her identity, her role as a spy, her connection to Colonel Matthews. And there was one more detail, a small, almost overlooked note at the bottom of the file. Transferred to Camp Hollibird. Signal Corps Training Center. Camp Hollibird. A military base in Maryland used for training intelligence officers, spies, and codebreakers. It was a long shot, but it was their only lead. Evelyn Reed might have gone there, seeking refuge, seeking help, seeking a way to disappear. Claudia felt a surge of hope. They were close. They were on the right track. Beyond the barbed wire, beyond the secrecy, beyond the danger, Evelyn Reed was waiting. Chapter 16. The Spy's Confession. Camp Hollibird was a sprawling military base, a maze of barracks, training grounds, and secretive facilities, surrounded by high fences and guarded by armed sentries. It was a place where spies were trained, codes were broken, and secrets were kept, a world far removed from the quiet streets of Arlington. Claudia and Arthur traveled to Maryland, their hearts pounding with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. They knew they were entering dangerous territory, that they were risking exposure, but they had to find Evelyn Reed. She was their only hope of unraveling the conspiracy and bringing justice to Oscar Grant. They couldn't simply walk onto the base and ask for Evelyn. They needed a plan, a way to infiltrate the facility, to find her without alerting the authorities, without revealing their true intentions. Arthur, with his military background, suggested a ruse. He would pose as a visiting officer, claiming to be conducting research on wartime communications, requesting access to the base's archives and personnel records. Claudia would accompany him, posing as his assistant. It was a risky plan, but it was their best chance. They prepared their cover story carefully, rehearsing their roles, anticipating the questions they might be asked, the challenges they might face. They arrived at Camp Hollibird, the imposing gates and armed guards a stark reminder of the secrecy and security that surrounded the facility. Arthur presented his fabricated credentials, his voice calm and authoritative, his demeanor confident and professional. The guards scrutinized their documents, their eyes narrowed, their expressions skeptical. Claudia held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest, fearing that their deception would be discovered, that they would be turned away, or worse, arrested. Finally, the guards nodded, their faces impassive. They waved them through, granting them access to the base. Claudia and Arthur entered Camp Hollibird, their senses on high alert, their eyes scanning the surroundings, their ears attuned to every sound. They were inside, but they were far from safe. They were surrounded by soldiers, spies, and secrets, and they had to be careful, discreet, and vigilant. They began their search, starting with the base's archives, where they hoped to find some record of Evelyn Reed, some indication of her presence, her activities, her whereabouts. Arthur, with his fabricated credentials, gained access to the archives, while Claudia waited outside, her nerves on edge, her mind racing with possibilities and fears. Hours passed, the silence broken only by the occasional passing soldier, the distant sounds of military drills, the hum of the base's machinery. Claudia paced anxiously, her eyes fixed on the entrance to the archives, waiting for Arthur to emerge. Finally, Arthur appeared, his face etched with a mixture of frustration and a glimmer of hope. "Nothing," he said, his voice low. "No records of Evelyn Reed. At least, not under that name." Claudia's heart sank. Another dead end? Or had Evelyn changed her identity again? But Arthur continued, "There's something else. I found a classified file, on a woman known only as Nightingale. She was a deep cover agent, working for the intelligence division. During the war, Nightingale, Evelyn Reed's code name. They were on the right track." "The file is incomplete," Arthur said. "Most of the information is redacted. But there's a mention of a safe house, a place where she sometimes met with her handler, near the base. A safe house, a potential hiding place, a place where Evelyn Reed might still be." Arthur had managed to memorize the location of the safe house, a small, isolated cottage on the outskirts of the base, hidden amidst a dense forest. They left Camp Hollowbird, their hearts pounding with a renewed sense of urgency. They had to find the safe house, to find Evelyn Reed, before it was too late. They drove to the location Arthur had described, the road winding through the dense forest, the trees casting long, eerie shadows. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, the silence broken only by the rustling of leaves and the occasional cry of a bird. They found the cottage, a small, dilapidated structure, seemingly abandoned, its windows boarded up, its door hanging precariously on its hinges. It looked like no one had been there for years. But Claudia felt a strange sense of unease, a feeling that they were being watched, that they were not alone. They approached the cottage cautiously, their hands on their weapons. Arthur had managed to bring his service revolver, their senses on high alert. Arthur kicked open the door, his gun drawn, his eyes scanning the dark interior. Claudia followed closely behind him, her heart pounding in her chest. The cottage was empty, dusty, and cobweb-filled. It looked like no one had been there for a long time. But as they searched the rooms, they found signs of recent occupation, a half-eaten meal, a discarded cigarette, a woman's scarf lying on the floor. Evelyn Reed had been there. But where was she now? Suddenly, they heard a noise, a faint rustling sound coming from the back of the cottage. Arthur raised his gun, his finger on the trigger, his body tense and ready. They crept towards the sound, their hearts pounding, their breath held. They reached a small, back room, and there, huddled in a corner, her eyes wide with fear, was Evelyn Reed. She was thin, almost emaciated, her clothes ragged and dirty, her hair matted and unkempt. She looked like she had been through hell. Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "What do you want?" Claudia stepped forward, her voice gentle and reassuring. "We're here to help you, Evelyn," she said. "We know about Colonel Matthews, about the conspiracy, about Oscar Grant." Evelyn's eyes widened, her expression a mixture of fear and disbelief. How do you know?" she whispered. Claudia explained everything, their investigation, their discoveries, their journey to find her. Evelyn listened in silence, her body shaking, her eyes filled with tears. When Claudia finished, Evelyn nodded slowly. I can tell you everything," she said, her voice barely audible. "I know who killed Oscar. I know who's behind it all. I have proof. The spy's confession. The truth at last." But the danger was far from over. They were still being hunted, still being watched. They had to get Evelyn to safety, to protect her, to expose the conspiracy before it was too late. Chapter 17. A Promise at Dawn. Evelyn Reed's willingness to confess, to reveal the truth about Oscar Grant's murder and the vast conspiracy behind it, was a turning point. But it also placed them all in immediate danger. They were exposed, vulnerable, and hunted by powerful, unseen enemies. "We need to get you out of here," Claudia said, her voice urgent. "We need to get you to safety." Evelyn nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and a flicker of newfound hope. "I have evidence," she said, her voice trembling. "Documents. Hidden. They prove everything." She led them to a loose floorboard beneath a ragged rug. Beneath it, she retrieved a small, metal box, locked and secured. "The key is with someone I trust," she said. "Someone in Arlington." Claudia and Arthur exchanged a look. They had to get Evelyn and the box back to Arlington, to retrieve the key, to unlock the evidence, to expose the conspiracy. But they couldn't risk traveling openly, not with Evelyn's life in danger. Arthur, with his military experience, devised a plan. They would travel under cover of darkness, avoiding the main roads, using back routes and hidden paths. They would leave immediately, before their presence at the safe house was discovered. They set off, their journey fraught with peril. They traveled through the night, the darkness their only ally, the silence broken only by the rustling of leaves, the hooting of owls, and the pounding of their own hearts. They avoided towns and villages, sticking to the woods and fields, their senses on high alert, their eyes scanning the shadows, their ears attuned to every sound. They were hunted, pursued, and they had to be careful, discreet, and vigilant. As dawn approached, they reached the outskirts of Arlington, exhausted, hungry, and terrified. But they were close, so close to safety, so close to exposing the truth. They found refuge in a small, abandoned barn, hidden amidst a cluster of trees, a place where they could rest, regroup, and plan their next move. Evelyn, weakened by her ordeal, collapsed on a pile of straw, her body shaking, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Claudia and Arthur watched over her, their concern growing with each passing moment. "We need to get you to a doctor," Claudia said, her voice filled with worry. "You need medical attention." Evelyn shook her head, her eyes filled with determination. "Not yet," she whispered. "First the key. The evidence. We have to expose them." She gave Claudia the name and address of the person who held the key to the metal box, a woman named Sarah Miller, the wife of Sergeant Michael Miller, Oscar Grant's confidant. Claudia remembered Sergeant Miller, the quiet, reserved man who had witnessed Oscar's murder, who had provided crucial testimony to Arthur. His wife, Sarah, was the keeper of Evelyn's secrets, the guardian of the evidence that could bring down the conspiracy. Claudia and Arthur decided to split up. Arthur would stay with Evelyn, protecting her, keeping her safe. Claudia would go to Sarah Miller, retrieve the key, and unlock the box. Claudia set off alone, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. She had to be careful, discreet. She couldn't risk being followed, being seen. She reached Sarah Miller's house, a modest, unassuming home on a quiet, residential street. She knocked on the door, her hand trembling slightly. A woman opened the door, her face etched with lines of worry and weariness. It was Sarah Miller, her eyes red-rimmed, her expression guarded. "Mrs. Miller," Claudia said, her voice low and urgent. "My name is Claudia Reed. I'm here about Evelyn Reed. She sent me." Sarah Miller's eyes widened, her expression a mixture of surprise and apprehension. She knew the dangers involved, the risks of harboring Evelyn's secrets. But she also knew that Claudia was telling the truth, that she was driven by a sense of justice, by a determination to help Evelyn. She ushered Claudia inside, closing the door behind her, her eyes scanning the street, her body tense and alert. "Evelyn, is she all right?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Claudia nodded. "She's alive," she said. "But she's in danger. We need the key, Mrs. Miller. The key to the box." Sarah Miller hesitated, her gaze shifting away, her mind clearly wrestling with the implications of Claudia's request. She knew the risks, the potential consequences. Finally, she nodded slowly. I have it," she said. "I've been keeping it safe. For Evelyn." She retrieved the key from a hidden compartment in a small, wooden jewelry box. She handed it to Claudia, her hand trembling slightly. "Be careful, Miss Reed," she said, her voice filled with warning. This is dangerous. They'll stop at nothing to protect themselves." Claudia nodded, her heart pounding with a renewed sense of urgency. She had the key. She had the means to unlock the evidence, to expose the conspiracy. She returned to the barn, where Arthur and Evelyn were waiting. She found them huddled together, their faces etched with anxiety, their bodies tense with anticipation. "I have it," Claudia said, holding up the key. "I have the key." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears of relief, her body slumping with a mixture of exhaustion and gratitude. They gathered around the metal box, their hands trembling, their hearts pounding. Claudia inserted the key into the lock, turning it slowly. The lock clicked open, revealing the contents within. Inside were documents, letters, photographs, and a small, leather-bound diary. It was Evelyn's journal, her record of the conspiracy, her evidence against the powerful men who had murdered Oscar Grant and countless others. As the sun rose, casting a golden glow over the horizon, they made a promise. A promise to Evelyn, to Oscar, to themselves, to all those who had suffered because of the conspiracy. They would expose the truth, no matter the cost. They would bring justice to the guilty, no matter how powerful they were. They would fight for a better world, a world free from corruption, from betrayal, from the darkness that had consumed so many lives. Chapter 18. The Empty Grave. With Evelyn Reed's evidence in hand, Claudia, Arthur, and Evelyn herself prepared to expose the conspiracy that had claimed Oscar Grant's life and threatened countless others. The documents, letters, photographs, and Evelyn's detailed diary provided irrefutable proof of the involvement of high-ranking military officials, including Captain Randolph and the now-deceased Colonel Matthews, in a scheme to divert supplies, profit from the war, and silence anyone who threatened to expose them. But the diary revealed something even more shocking. The conspiracy extended beyond the military, reaching into the highest echelons of the government. A name, mentioned repeatedly in Evelyn's entries, sent a chill down Claudia's spine. Secretary of War, Newton Baker. Secretary Baker, a respected public figure, a man of apparent integrity and unwavering patriotism, was implicated in the conspiracy. He had been using his position to manipulate the flow of supplies, to enrich himself and his allies, and to cover up the crimes of his subordinates. Claudia knew that exposing Secretary Baker would be a monumental task, fraught with danger and resistance. He was a powerful man, with friends in high places, and he wouldn't hesitate to use his influence to silence his accusers. But they had no choice. They had come too far, risked too much, to back down now. They had a duty to Oscar Grant, to Evelyn Reed, to all those who had suffered because of the conspiracy, to bring the truth to light, no matter the cost. They decided to take their evidence to the press, to a journalist they could trust, someone with a reputation for integrity and a willingness to challenge the powerful. They chose a reporter named Henry Davies, a veteran investigative journalist for the Washington Post, known for his fearless reporting and his unwavering commitment to truth. They arranged a secret meeting with Davies, providing him with copies of Evelyn's evidence, detailing the conspiracy, naming names, outlining the crimes. Davies was initially skeptical, reluctant to believe that such a vast and far-reaching conspiracy could exist within the highest levels of government. But as he examined the documents, as he listened to Evelyn's testimony, as he saw the fear and determination in Claudia's and Arthur's eyes, he realized that they were telling the truth. He saw the irrefutable proof, the damning evidence, the web of corruption that extended from the battlefields of France to the halls of power in Washington. Davies agreed to publish the story, to expose the conspiracy, to bring the guilty to justice. He knew the risks, the potential backlash, the power of the individuals he was about to challenge. But he was a journalist, a seeker of truth, and he wouldn't be silenced. The story broke, sending shockwaves through Washington and across the nation. The Washington Post published a series of articles detailing the conspiracy, naming names, revealing the crimes. The public was outraged, demanding answers, demanding justice. Secretary Baker vehemently denied the accusations, claiming it was a politically motivated attack, a smear campaign orchestrated by his enemies. He used his influence to try to suppress the story, to discredit Davies and the Washington Post, to silence his accusers. But the truth was out, and it couldn't be contained. The evidence was overwhelming, The testimony of Evelyn Reed and the others was compelling, and the public outcry was deafening. The government was forced to act. A special prosecutor was appointed, an investigation was launched, and arrests were made. Captain Randolph, along with several other military officials implicated in the conspiracy, were taken into custody, facing charges of murder, conspiracy, and treason. But Secretary Baker remained defiant, using his power and influence to evade justice. He claimed he was innocent, that he had been framed, that he was a victim of a vast conspiracy. Claudia, Arthur, and Evelyn knew that the fight was far from over. They had exposed the conspiracy, but they hadn't yet brought down its mastermind. They had to find a way to prove Secretary Baker's guilt, to bring him to justice. As they continued their investigation, they discovered a hidden connection between Secretary Baker and Oscar Grant, a link that went beyond the conspiracy, a personal vendetta that had fueled Baker's determination to silence Oscar. They learned that Oscar Grant's father, a prominent businessman, had been a rival of Secretary Baker, a competitor in the cutthroat world of Washington politics and finance. Baker had resented the elder Grant, had sought to destroy him, and when Oscar had stumbled upon the conspiracy, Baker had seen an opportunity to eliminate both father and son, to settle an old score and protect his own interests. This new revelation added another layer of complexity to the case, a personal motive that explained Baker's ruthlessness and his determination to silence Oscar at any cost. Claudia decided to take a bold, unexpected step. She decided to visit Oscar Grant's grave, to pay her respects, to seek inspiration, to find a way to connect with the man whose death had sparked her relentless quest for justice. She went to Arlington National Cemetery, the vast, hallowed ground where so many soldiers lay buried, their lives cut short by war and violence. She found Oscar's grave, a simple headstone bearing his name, his rank, and the date of his death. As she stood there, gazing at the headstone, a strange feeling came over her. A sense of unease, a feeling that something wasn't right. She looked around, her eyes scanning the surrounding graves, the rows of white headstones stretching as far as the eye could see. And then she saw it, a small, almost imperceptible disturbance in the earth near Oscar's grave. The ground looked uneven, as if it had been recently disturbed. Claudia's heart pounded. She knelt down, her fingers probing the earth, feeling for any sign of anything. And then she felt it. A loose stone, a hidden cavity beneath the surface. She carefully removed the stone, revealing a small, empty space. The grave had been opened.
But why?
And by whom? Claudia realized, with a chilling certainty, that Oscar Grant's body was not in his grave. It had been removed, stolen, perhaps destroyed.
But why?
What was the purpose of this desecration? The empty grave, the missing body, the final, shocking twist in the conspiracy. Claudia knew that she had stumbled upon something even more sinister, even more disturbing than she had ever imagined. The truth, it seemed, was still buried, hidden beneath layers of deception and lies. She realized that Grant may still be alive. Chapter 19. The Reckoning of Truth. The discovery of the empty grave sent a shockwave through Claudia. The realization that Oscar Grant's body was missing, that his grave had been desecrated, added a new layer of mystery and horror to the already complex conspiracy. It also sparked a flicker of hope, a desperate, almost impossible belief that Oscar might still be alive. Claudia immediately contacted Arthur and Evelyn, sharing her shocking discovery, her growing suspicion that Oscar might not have died in France. They were stunned, disbelieving, but also filled with a renewed sense of urgency. They had to find out what had happened to Oscar's body, why it had been removed from his grave, and whether there was any possibility that he was still alive. They knew they couldn't go to the authorities, not yet. The conspiracy reached into the highest levels of government, and they couldn't trust anyone. They had to conduct their own investigation, discreetly, carefully, and quickly. They started with the obvious: Arlington National Cemetery. They needed to find out who had access to the graves, who might have been involved in the removal of Oscar's body, who might have known about the conspiracy. They questioned the groundskeepers, the gravediggers, the cemetery administrators, anyone who might have had information. But they were met with silence, denial, and fear. No one wanted to talk. No one wanted to get involved. The conspiracy had cast a long shadow, silencing witnesses, intimidating anyone who dared to question the official narrative. But Claudia was persistent, determined. She wouldn't give up, not until she had uncovered the truth. She spent days at the cemetery, poring over records, examining maps, searching for any clue, any anomaly, any indication of what had happened to Oscar's body. Finally, she found something. A small, almost overlooked entry in the cemetery's logbook, a record of a late-night burial, a clandestine operation conducted under cover of darkness, shortly after Oscar Grant's official funeral. The entry was vague, cryptic, providing no names, no details, just a date, a time, and a location. Section 27, near the old oak tree. Claudia knew Section 27. It was a remote, isolated section of the cemetery, rarely visited, a place where unmarked graves and forgotten souls lay buried. It was the perfect place to hide a body, to conceal a secret. She and Arthur went to Section 27, their hearts pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread. They searched the area, their eyes scanning the ground, looking for any sign of disturbance, any indication of a recent burial. And then they found it, a small, unmarked grave, hidden beneath the branches of the old oak tree. The earth was loose, uneven, as if it had been recently disturbed. They began to dig, their hands trembling, their hearts pounding in their chests. They dug for hours, the silence broken only by the sound of their shovels scraping against the earth, the rustling of leaves, and the distant cries of birds. Finally, they reached the coffin. They opened it, their breath held, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope. The coffin was empty, but there was something else. A small, metal object lying at the bottom of the coffin. Claudia picked it up, her fingers brushing away the dirt and grime. It was a locket, a silver locket, engraved with the initials OG and YAR, Oscar Grant and Eleanor Reed. Claudia recognized it immediately. It was the locket Oscar had given to Eleanor before he shipped out for France, a token of their love, a promise of his return. But why was it here? In an empty coffin? In an unmarked grave? The answer came to Claudia in a flash of insight, a sudden, terrifying realization. Oscar Grant was not dead. He was alive. And he had been hiding, all this time, protected by someone who knew the truth, someone who had helped him escape the conspiracy. The empty grave, the locket, the clandestine burial, it was all a ruse, a carefully orchestrated deception to make it appear that Oscar had died in France, to protect him from the powerful men who wanted him dead. But who had orchestrated this deception? And where was Oscar now? Claudia knew the answer. There was only one person who could have done this, one person who had the knowledge, the resources, and the motive to save Oscar's life. Evelyn Reed. Evelyn, the spy, the mistress, the woman who had betrayed her country for love, had also betrayed the conspiracy to save the man she loved. She had faked Oscar's death, hidden his body, and helped him escape. But where had she taken him? Where were they hiding? Claudia remembered Evelyn's words, her cryptic reference to someone she trusted, someone who held the key to the metal box, Sarah Miller, the wife of Sergeant Michael Miller. Sarah Miller. She wasn't just the keeper of Evelyn's secrets. She was also Oscar's protector. She had been hiding him, all this time, sheltering him from the conspiracy, waiting for the day when he could safely return. Claudia, Arthur, and Evelyn raced to Sarah Miller's house, their hearts pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. They had to find Oscar, to bring him back, to expose the conspiracy once and for all. They found Sarah Miller at home, her face etched with worry and exhaustion. She had been waiting for them, expecting them, knowing that the day of reckoning had finally arrived. "He's here," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He's been waiting for you." She led them to a hidden room, a secret chamber concealed behind a bookcase. And there, standing in the shadows, his face pale and drawn, but his eyes filled with a flicker of life, was Oscar Grant. He was alive. The reckoning of truth had begun. The final confrontation, the ultimate showdown with the forces of darkness, was about to unfold. Chapter 20. A Love Unforgotten. The sight of Oscar Grant, alive but bearing the scars of his ordeal, was a moment of profound emotion for Claudia, Arthur, and especially Evelyn. Tears flowed freely, a mixture of relief, joy, and the lingering pain of years spent in hiding and fear. Oscar, though weakened, embraced Evelyn with a tenderness that spoke volumes about their enduring love. He looked at Claudia and Arthur with gratitude, recognizing them as the allies who had risked everything to uncover the truth. "Thank you," he said, his voice hoarse but firm. "You saved my life. You saved us both." The reunion, however, was tempered by the knowledge that the danger was far from over. Secretary Baker and his co-conspirators were still at large, still powerful, and still determined to silence anyone who threatened to expose them. They knew they had to act quickly, to bring Oscar's testimony and Evelyn's evidence to the authorities, to ensure that justice was finally served. But they couldn't simply walk into a police station or a government office. They needed a plan, a way to protect themselves and Oscar, to ensure that their story was heard, believed, and acted upon. They decided to trust Henry Davies, the journalist from the Washington Post, who had already risked his career to expose the initial stages of the conspiracy. They contacted him, arranging a secret meeting, revealing the shocking truth. Oscar Grant was alive. Davies was stunned, disbelieving at first, but then overwhelmed with the magnitude of the story. He realized that this was the final piece of the puzzle, the ultimate expose that would bring down Secretary Baker and his entire network of corruption. He agreed to help them, to arrange a meeting with the special prosecutor, to ensure that Oscar's testimony and Evelyn's evidence were presented to the authorities in a safe and secure manner. The meeting was arranged at a secret location, a hidden room in a downtown hotel, far from the prying eyes of Secretary Baker and his allies. Oscar, Evelyn, Claudia, Arthur, and Davies gathered together, their hearts pounding with a mixture of anticipation and fear. Oscar told his story, his voice filled with emotion, recounting the horrors of the war, his discovery of the conspiracy, the attempt on his life, his escape, and his years in hiding. He described the ruthlessness of Secretary Baker, the extent of his corruption, and his determination to silence anyone who threatened to expose him. Evelyn corroborated Oscar's testimony, providing the documents, the letters, the photographs, and her own diary as irrefutable proof of the conspiracy. She described her role as a spy, her betrayal of her country, and her ultimate decision to betray the conspiracy to save the man she loved. The special prosecutor, a man named Robert Jackson, listened intently, his face grim, his eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and outrage. He realized that he was facing the biggest case of his career, a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government, a scandal that threatened to shake the foundations of American democracy. He assured them that he would take their evidence seriously, that he would pursue the investigation to its fullest extent, that he would bring the guilty to justice, no matter how powerful they were. The wheels of justice began to turn. Secretary Baker was arrested, along with several other high-ranking government officials implicated in the conspiracy. They were charged with treason, conspiracy, murder, and a host of other crimes. The trial was a sensation, a media circus that captivated the nation. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimony of Oscar Grant and Evelyn Reed was compelling, and the public outcry was deafening. Secretary Baker and his co-conspirators were found guilty on all counts. They were sentenced to long prison terms, their careers ruined, their reputations shattered. Justice, at last, had been served. For Claudia, the journey had been long and arduous, fraught with danger, deception, and heartbreak. But it had also been a journey of self-discovery, of courage, of resilience. She had started as a grieving widow, a lonely typist, searching for answers to a simple mystery. She had ended as a heroine, a champion of justice, a woman who had dared to challenge the powerful and expose the truth. For Arthur, it was a chance to redeem his friend and find some personal peace, knowing he'd helped deliver Oscar from an unjust fate. He had found his courage again in protecting Claudia and fighting alongside her. For Oscar and Evelyn, it was a new beginning, a chance to rebuild their lives, to live openly and freely, without fear, without secrets. Their love, tested by war, betrayal, and years of separation, had endured. It was a love unforgotten, a love reborn. As they stood together, watching the sun rise over Arlington, they knew that the scars of the past would always remain. But they also knew that they had faced the darkness and emerged victorious. They had fought for justice, for truth, for love, and they had won. The badge that had started it all, the discarded symbol of sacrifice and betrayal, now held a new meaning. It was a reminder of the courage, the resilience, and the enduring power of love in the face of adversity. It was a symbol of a love unforgotten, a promise kept, a future secured. Epilogue. The years that followed the trial were a time of healing and rebuilding. Oscar and Evelyn, finally free from the shadows of the conspiracy, settled in a quiet Virginia town, far from the bustle and intrigue of Washington. They adopted a child, a young girl orphaned by the influenza pandemic, and created a loving home filled with warmth, laughter, and the simple joys of family life. Oscar, though his health had suffered during his years in hiding, found work as a carpenter, his hands finding solace in the shaping of wood, his spirit mending with each carefully crafted piece. Evelyn, her past as a spy forever behind her, devoted herself to her family and community, becoming a respected and beloved figure in their small town. Arthur Blackwood, his own war wounds slowly healing, found a measure of peace in helping Oscar and Evelyn rebuild their lives. He remained a close friend, a trusted confidant, a silent guardian of their secret. He eventually found love again, marrying a local schoolteacher, a woman who understood his quiet strength and his deep-seated sense of honor. Claudia Reed, her life forever changed by her courageous pursuit of justice, left the War Department and embarked on a new career. She became a writer, a chronicler of the human experience, her words infused with the wisdom, compassion, and resilience she had gained during her extraordinary journey. She wrote about the war, about the conspiracy, about the power of love, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. She never forgot Oscar and Evelyn, their story a constant source of inspiration and a reminder of the importance of fighting for truth, even in the face of overwhelming odds. She never married again, though there were suitors. The memory of Thomas, her first love, remained a cherished presence in her heart, a reminder of the innocence lost and the lessons learned. But she found fulfillment in her work, in her friendships, and in her unwavering commitment to justice and truth. The abandoned badge, once a symbol of mystery and betrayal, became a treasured keepsake, a reminder of the perilous journey that had transformed their lives. Claudia kept it in a small, velvet-lined box, alongside the faded photograph of Oscar and Evelyn on their wedding day, a tangible link to the past and a beacon of hope for the future. Arlington, the town steeped in grief and shadowed by the memories of war, slowly began to heal. The National Cemetery remained a place of solemn remembrance, a testament to the sacrifices made by so many. But it also became a place of hope, a symbol of the enduring power of the human spirit to overcome adversity, to find love and redemption amidst the ruins of war. The echoes of the past still lingered, whispers of betrayal, secrets, and sacrifice. But they were fading, replaced by a new chorus of voices, voices of courage, resilience, and hope. The reckoning of truth had brought justice, healing, and a renewed sense of purpose to those who had dared to challenge the darkness and embrace the light. The low,